Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to this evening's GAA Coach Webinar with Shane Mangan. I'll just tell you a little bit about Shane before we start. So Shane Mangan is from Oldcastle and Meath. He's a sports scientist and lecturer. He's one of the leading researchers in Gaelic sports and has recently finished writing his PhD in the area of technical and running performance in Gaelic football. He has worked with a number of intercounty and club teams across football, hurling, ladies Gaelic football and camogie. He's currently based in Technological University Dublin. He lectures on sports science and health and sports studies courses. Tonight's session title is the Tactical Periodisation Model for Gaelic Football, and it's a presentation will focus on a contemporary approach to Gaelic football training based around the technical and physical demands of the sport. Shane's session tonight will be about 40 minutes or so we should have 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. So for anyone who wants to ask a question for Shane as we go along, if you just click on the Q&A box, which is a little speech bubble with a question mark in it in front on your screen, you can type in your question there and I'll be able to get it and pose the questions for Shane when we're finished the presentation. So Shane, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for asking me on this evening. Thanks to everyone that's joined in as well. I know it's a strange time, but hopefully we can use this time to expand our knowledge in the game, I suppose. I'm going to be talking about tactical periodisation this evening. So before I talk about that, I'll just give a bit of an introduction to myself. I've studied sports science and health for 4 years. After this, I went on to a master's in sports science. I then transferred to PhD, and I just, as Peter said, I just submitted that there about 4 weeks ago, and that was on the running performance and technical performance in Gaelic football. Since 2015, I've been lecturing in TU Dublin and Tala on sports science courses. I've worked with a range of teams across the 4 Gaelic sports. That was from working as a sports scientist to performance analyst, also doing some consultancy work with teams in terms of getting them set up with performance analysis and GPS. So in terms of tactical periodisation, we're going to go through what it is. Some people might have heard the term before, others may not have. We're going to go through how we created an evidence-based approach for Gaelic football for tactical periodisation, and then I'll talk through some findings that I've found in club and intercounty Gaelic football. So it was originally developed by Professor Vitor Frade in Portugal for soccer. It was popularised by high-profile Portuguese soccer coaches that came across to England to work in the Premier League. And one of the key principles of tactical periodisation is that the tactical, technical, physical and physiological components are never trained in isolation, and they're always linked back to one of the 4 game moments. So what are the 4 game moments? Okay, so you might have heard of these before. Maybe if you've done an FAI coaching course or a UEFA course, it's something that you always touch on. They're popular in soccer. They're defensive organisation, defence to attack transition, offensive organisation, and attack to defence transition. So these are all things that are that we can apply to Gaelic football and other team sports. Okay, so we can break down the game into these sections. I myself would have used these before for doing things like opposition scouting analysis. So we could break down how does a team organise themselves under defending, how do they organise themselves under attacking, and then the 2 in between when they're transitioning. But in Gaelic football, we think that there's a need for another game moment. Okay, so there's not just them 4 game moments, there's also a contest for possession. So why is this important in Gaelic football? Well, number one, if we look at the percentage of possessions leading to scores, so in soccer, that's 8%. Research by Kevin McGuigan has shown that losing teams will score 23% of their possessions, and winning teams will score 33% of their possessions leading to scores. So that's quite a big difference. Where do contests of possession originate? So one is a throw-up at the start of each half. Another much more common one is a kick-out. So in a match we have 44 kick-outs. They're the origin of 29 to 33% of all team possessions in a game. And then we know that kick-outs that are gone to the wings will result in scoring opportunities 31% of times, and then kick-outs that are taken centrally will result in scoring opportunities 21% of times. So there's much more of an emphasis on the importance of possession in Gaelic football compared to soccer, so that's why we've included it. So the tactical periodisation model, it all sort of centres around the game model, and it'll start off with this. And basically the game model is how the coach wants the game to be played. based on their philosophies, based on their learnings. But they must also consider the players that they have available when developing their own approach. So coach can't just take one philosophy if they're working on one team and then throw it down on another team that they start working with, because it mightn't suit the players. To give an example of that, maybe a coach wants to deliver the ball in long, quickly into the full forward line, okay? If there's someone like Kieran Donaghy or Michael Murphy, maybe they're going to be able to kick the ball in high because they're strong in physical contests in the air. If there's someone like Jamie Brennan, maybe they want to kick the ball in low and make use of his pace, okay? So we have to adapt it to the players that we have. And the tactical periodization model, it simplifies the game into two things, into principles of play and sub-principles of play for each of the game moments. So in our case, in each of the 5 game moments. So principles of play are general behaviours that the coach wants to perform, and then sub-principles of play are more specific tactics to play in that principle. So I'll go through an example here. If we take the moment of defensive attack transition, and a coach wants to attack down the wings, okay? So what we can do is we can break this into 2 sub-principles. The first sub-principle is up in the top diagram, you'll see, and it's working the ball out of defence from the wing back or from the cornerback position. So here, things you might be looking for is creating an overlap, making hard runs, flushing out your runs, okay? So that'd be something you could work on. The next sub-principle then is making space for the ball delivery, okay? So that's going to be all about forward movement and making sure that the person takes the right option on the ball. Now, these sub-principles should be worked on separately. If you have enough players to do both drills at the same time at different ends of the pitch, that's fine. More often than not, you won't have enough players if you're working at club level. So you can do these separately, but we wouldn't join them together until we get both of them correct individually. Then we would start looking to bring it all together in one move, okay? Again, if numbers is an issue, so we have 30 players on the pitch here, maybe in club training you might have 15 or 18 players. What you could do in this scenario is just say, for example, the goalkeepers aren't involved in this play, you could take them out, and probably on the opposite side of the pitch to which wing you're going down, there's probably about 12 players there you could take out. So we'd have about 18 players in this drill. The key thing to not do in this drill then would be to take out some of the players that are going to be important in the actual phase of possession. So we don't want to take away one of the wing forwards or a corner forward or the corner back on that side. So in the name of tactical periodization, there's a big emphasis on the tactical, obviously. And according to Vitor Frade, by structuring the game model into principles and sub-principles, you can turn the unpredictability of the game events into potential predictability. So that's what you're trying to do with these sub-principles and principles. I'll just go back to this diagram and talk through it as an example. So nowadays, most teams are going to be working on kickouts. They'll have their own kick-out strategies. So if you get a kick-out, more often than not, your defenders and midfielders are going to know where to go. If they maybe, say for example, the half-backs go into a cluster on the 45-metre line, we can predict what the opposition might do against this, okay? So they might go man-to-man, they might go zonal, they might go a mixture, but we're predicting what the opposition is trying to do. So that's what it means about potential predictability. So the same can be applied in a game. If we have a good idea of what we're going to do, if we want to work the ball up the wing, then we can predict what the opposition wants to do. So are the opposition going to press us high up the pitch? Are they going to drop off? We have to work out both of those scenarios. So when it comes to design and training activities, okay, so first of all, you're going to have your warm-up, you're going to have your athletic preparation, you might have some extra fitness work that needs to be done or speed work. But when it comes to doing activities with the ball, we can break it down into 3 different areas, okay? So the first one is skill, the second one is behaviours, and the third one is match scenarios. So more often than not, if you're doing a skill and training session, it's going to apply to what's going on in the match, okay? There's very few skills that you could think of that aren't going to apply to what's going to happen in the match. So the first question is answered, yes, it is something you perform in a match. An area where a lot of people would fall down then is there decision making involved in this activity? So the examples I'm talking through is for adult level. Of course, if you're working with younger athletes, then you're going to do a high level of technical skill proficiency work with them, okay, which is going to be more basic. But when we get to the adult level, we need to have decision making in the activities that we're doing, okay. So common drill that's done for hand passing would be 4 groups, and there are 4 cones, and either you pass the ball laterally or else you go diagonally. Is this coaching decision making? No, it's not, okay. So people are just following the ball to one cone and then going back. Can we add pressure in this? Yeah, you can sometimes if the coach maybe says don't drop the ball or go hard for 10 seconds, but really it's not really replicating what's going on in the match. So we need to bring it up a level from that. That's not really much use to us. If you do want, if there's players that are weak on specific skills, maybe you might take the time before a training session to work on that with them, or to get them to work on it. So if training's at 7:30, get them to go out on the pitch 7 o'clock, 7:15, work in smaller groups on specific skills, because we want to spend as least amount of time as possible in the training session working on specific skills, because they should be rudimentary at that stage. So if you want to bring it on a level then from the 4 cones, another common one that's done is a 3-man weave, okay. So most people is either taken part in this or coached it at some stage, and it's 3 groups of players, and they're going to start off maybe around the 65-meter line, midfield, or 45-meter line. They're going to weave in and out, pass the ball, and then maybe one person's going to take a shot. Maybe you might work at that 2 other people pass balls in, so then each player gets a shot, okay. So again, is this replicating a decision making of a match? No, it's not, okay. So there's no decision that needs to be made there. So how can we make this more realistic? Okay, so it's very unlikely that you're going to have your 3 players starting off at the 65-meter line evenly placed in the center of the pitch, okay. So one thing you might be able to do is maybe to start some of the 2 of the runners on either wing. You get the ball carrier to come down the middle, and then you get the 2 guys to loop around, and then you can start weaving in. But the other element that you need to have there is defensive pressure, okay. So you're going to need to execute these skills under pressure in a match, so you're going to need some sort of defensive pressure there as well. So immediately it's looking more like a match scenario than just a 3-man weave. The other thing then is behaviors, okay. So when you're talking about behaviors in a game model, it could be maybe the coach wants the team to have good discipline, maybe they want them to work hard. If it doesn't coach a behavior that you want, then don't do it, keep away from it. If it does, then you need to ask yourself the question, does it allow the player to make a decision on their behavior? So just taking the example of working hard, okay, so we want, every coach wants their players to work hard. And if we get them to do something like mass runs, which is 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, they're going to have to work hard for that. But is it making them make a decision on their behavior? Is it making them ask, do I need to work hard here? Okay, so more often than not, they're just going to go through the motions. They'll do what you tell them to do. So what we want to do is to design training games where they have to make a decision, are they going to work hard? So if you take maybe a 4v4 small-sided game, it's going to be very easy to work out if players are working hard in that or not. The player is going to know themselves, are they letting the team down? Are the other 3 players doing a lot of work and I'm not doing work? Okay, so straight away they have to be making that decision that they need to work hard, because when it comes to a match, the coach isn't going to be telling every player where to run and how hard to run. They need to make that decision themselves. And the final one then is match scenarios. Okay, so again, if you don't do it in a match, then don't do it in training. Okay, there's no point in coaching that, because it's not coaching the decisions that you're going to need in a match. If it is, then yeah, of course, do it. So an example of this, a commonly one that I would see going wrong, is backs and forwards. So if you think of a traditional game of backs and forwards, you'll have a goalkeeper, you'll have 6 backs and 6 forwards, you'll have probably 4 midfielders and a couple of more floating around there, depending on the numbers that you have. So if we're working the ball out from the goalkeeper from a kick out, or from maybe a ball that drops short, that's fine, okay? So that is something that we see in a match. We'd see a similar amount of players around the goalkeeper. But most often in backs and forwards, the ball is worked from out to in, okay? So it starts off in the middle of the pitch. So if a midfielder picks up the ball in the middle of the pitch, they look up and they see 6 backs and 6 forwards in their positions. Okay, so how often does this happen in a match in 2020? So probably twice, okay, and it's from the 2 throw-ups. So we want to be realistic. So where are players going to be? So maybe we'll have 4 players inside the 45 and 2 players will have dropped back after running back from the previous attack. And then is the defensive team going to have 4 players and 4 defenders and 4 attackers? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. They might have an extra man in front there sweeping around as a +1. So now if we start a drill with maybe one of the extra forwards ahead came back, he starts off with the ball in the midfield. He looks up and he sees 4 forwards inside, maybe being marked by 5 defenders. Okay, so this is more of a match scenario that we see. So we need to train for this. So that's sort of covering the tactical part of the model. Okay, the other part of it is the periodization part. So in this diagram here is the morpho cycle, which is basically just a weekly training cycle used in soccer for this. So we see we'll have a match. Don't worry too much about the terminology that's used to describe each day, because this is translated from Portuguese, so it doesn't just translate that well. So after a game, they'll have a day off, recovery, first day back in training. They'll have some active recovery, some light easy work. The next day they will work on some small-sided games, working on some of the sub-principles of play. The following day they will work on principles of play, so working in larger groups and for longer duration. The day after that then they'll be working on specific speed work and really short snappy drills. And then the day before the game then they're going to have activation and just some recovery. An important thing to note about the soccer models for tactical periodization is that they don't have any gym work that's separate. Okay, so everything is done on the pitch. It's just not really the style of the European soccer, but we will have it in Gaelic football. So what is the weekly training cycle? Okay, so the morph cycle, it follows the same pattern each week throughout the season, and it'll only be altered if the number of days between matches change. So if we go back there, we see that there's 1 day less between matches, so to take 1 session out. The morph cycle is structured so there's a horizontal alteration throughout the week. So what this means is that it's altering the emphasis of the physical, physiological and tactical elements at specific stages during the week. Why is this done? So it's switched on a daily basis to ensure that the training of the physical components is balanced, so we don't miss out on any of the physical components, and we also need to allow sufficient recovery of each physical component. So for example, if we do strength training on a Monday night and then we decide to do a speed session then on the Tuesday, the player's ability to actually run at their top speed is going to be impacted by the strength session the night before. So we need to give the body time to recover in between that. So that's why we have to try and keep that structure throughout each week over the season. So when we look at applying such a model to Gaelic football, there's a number of considerations that we have to take. Okay, so number one, it's an amateur sport. We have less training days. So in the soccer models, they're training 5 days a week in addition to their 2 matches. Players have to travel long distances for training often, so they could be living away for work. Again, work commitments, so players aren't going to have the same recovery as elite athletes. And also, what are the demands of the sport? Okay, so before we went about designing this training model, we had to look at the demands of the sport. So here is just a graph comparing the run demands of the game, and we're comparing elite to sub-elite male Gaelic football players. It's an obvious enough observation that the elite players will run more than sub-elite because they play for 10 minutes more. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. When we look at this in terms of meters per minute, so the number of meters that every player did for each minute that they're on the pitch. Okay, so there's not as big a difference now when we look at it in terms of meters per minute. In fact, half forwards for sub-elite will actually run more than elite half forwards. Similar again then for the ladies game. So again, there's not a whole lot of variation between the positions. Half backs and midfielders and sub-elite will actually run more per minute than elite players, and then there's a large variation there between half forwards. So again, this is on a smaller sample size, so that just may be reflective of this. So how is this sort of information useful to us? So number one, it's useful for planning training load around matches. So if we know maybe that on a Sunday a player is going to run 10 kilometers in the match, how do we base our training week around that? Okay, how do we build up to that? How do we taper down to that? The other key one that needs to be done is creating training games to replicate these match demands. So I'll just go back to the previous graph here. If we take just say midfielders there in the sub-elite, okay, so they will average 133 meters per minute. If we want to train above the match demands, what we can do is create drills that would allow these players to run maybe 150, 160 meters per minute, because then they'll be training above the match demands. Now remember that these are just averages across the whole game, so it's average across the 60 minutes. So maybe in 1 minute a player might do 180 meters, 200 meters. So we need to be able to prepare the players for these demands. The next thing we look at here is with technical demands. I just chose 3 performance indicators to look at: possessions, pass attempts, and tackle attempts. So this is all from inter-county match play. And we can see there's a larger variation between positions compared to the running demands, particularly if you compare midfielders to a goalkeeper or full back. So they're going to be on the ball a lot more. If we look at it in males then, so again, a similar enough trend is evident that, you know, the full backs aren't getting on the ball as much, they're not making as many pass attempts. Okay, so how is this information going to be useful for us? So when we're designing our training drills, can we take playing position into account? So if we're looking at our full backs, they're not getting on as much ball as possible. Okay, so they're not getting on as much ball as the other positions. So is this a tactical thing? Are our kickouts going past them? Is it something that we're not doing right in training? Are they not winning enough 50-50 contests and full forwards are getting the ball ahead of them? Can we use our full backs to give our half backs a rest and maybe push them on up the pitch? So they're sort of things that we could work out. And then again, the other thing is creating training games to overexpose players to these technical demands. So a ladies Gaelic footballer, midfielder will touch the ball once every 2 minutes. So can we create training games that they'll touch the ball twice a minute or 4 times a minute or even more than that? So now that we know the demands of the sport, how can we work this into creating a training model for the sport? One thing I've mentioned there so far is training load, okay, and I know that not a lot of club teams are going to have access to GPS systems. So one way around that for measuring training load is looking at internal training load. And you might have seen this scale before. The RP scale is basically how hard did you perceive the exercise to be. So it goes from 1 to 10. Okay, so if we bring this chart along to training, along to matches, we can ask the players how hard they found this session. Then what we do is multiply their score by the number of minutes that the activity lasted. So for example, a match in a warm-up might last 100 minutes and the player said it was a number 8 on the scale, it was very hard. So we'd multiply these two numbers and you get 800 arbitrary units. So that's just our training load for that. They thought it was 800, okay? So now we can use that to inform our training model. So what I've done here is I've incorporated the training load on the y-axis, and we see our match there is at 800 units. And we have, like the soccer models, we have 6 days between matches and 5 days between matches. So I'll go through each day briefly here, and then I'll go in more detail in the next couple of slides. So after a match, we will have a recovery day with some strength maintenance. This would be a non-contact session, so players could do this at home or they could do it in their club gym or local gym. So because the players are amateur, we don't want to have to, particularly if it's inter-county level, we don't want them to have to travel to training like a lot of times. So we have 3 contact days here per week rather than the 5 in soccer. We can change this down to 2 contact days in club level if you want. So the second gym session would be supervised in county, but club players could do that individually. So after our recovery day, we'd work on the sub-principles of play, working in those smaller groups and looking at developing our endurance. Day after that, we'll be off completely. Day after that, we'll be working on principles of play. So working in larger groups, and then the following day would be working on speed and explosive movements in the gym. Again, before a match, we'll have a day off. Players can do their pre-activation there. So the day after a match, okay, so the first thing we need to be thinking about is recovery. So in a match, players are going to do muscle damage and they need to recover and regenerate. So this is just an example of a chart that we're using with the senior hurlers in Meath this year. And basically after the game and the day or so after a game, players have to accumulate 20 points, okay, so to do whatever it is on the chart to get that up. So it just means that the players are thinking about it. The other thing is strength maintenance, okay, so well, most teams are going to do some form of pre-season strength gaining training or whatever, or program before the season starts, and you might work into some power then. But an issue that I'd see a lot of teams doing is stopping this as the season goes on. So the teams have gotten better at it in the last number of years, but before you would have seen, you know, players doing this 8-week pre-season block and then they don't go back to the gym for the rest of the year, okay? So if that happens, then you're going to lose the muscle mass that you've built up. So research in soccer has shown that one strength session every week is effective at maintaining strength and sprint performance. And it's recommended that this is done 1 to 2 days after a match and at least 2 to 3 days before the next match. So the first group session that we'd have of the week would be the sub-principles of play. So this would work out approximately 60% the load of a match. So if we take our match load at 800, so it's 60% of that. And players aren't going to be fully recovered from the previous match. However, this is going to be the heaviest day of the week, so it is placed furthest away from the next match. So the typical training activities that we might do on this day would be working in small groups, working on the sub-principles of play that we spoke about earlier, being exposed to challenging anaerobic conditions above the match demands, okay, so working a lot harder than you would over the average in the match. So things like this could be done through small-sided games. So most people are probably familiar with small-sided games at this stage. Basically what they are is that they're working in smaller pitch sizes. There's smaller amount of players that take part in them. They're frequently used in soccer, and I suppose the benefit of them is that they're a combination of the physical, physiological and technical, and you can work in some tactical elements to it as well. But it means that you don't need to train, you don't need to be doing extra runs maybe instead of it, okay, so it lets you work with the ball. But I suppose in Gaelic football, we don't really know a whole lot about them in terms of what they look like, what are the outputs of them. So we decided to design a study looking at how does changing the pitch size affect the output of these games, and also are they effective at preparing players for matches, because at the end of the day that's what counts, is preparing them for matches. We decided to compare 3 different pitch sizes, 40 by 20 metre, 60 by 20 metre and 80 by 20 metre. The games are 4 minutes long and they're played by 2 teams of 4 players. All players wore GPS to look at their running performance, heart rate, to look at their physiological performance, and all the games are videoed for the technical performance. Basically, the game was designed by myself and with 2 of the coaches at the club that we carried out the study. We did about 40 games altogether. So the aim of the game was, there was 2 sets of gates at either end of the pitch, so players could score by carrying the ball through either gate. If a team scored in one gate, then the end in which they were shooting into changed. They couldn't restart play until all of the players on their team were on the end line and the opposition team were on the line of cones that's a quarter of the pitch up there, okay? And this changed, so you'll see that in the first pitch, these set of cones are 10 metres out, second pitch is 15, and the third pitch is 20, okay? So it's a quarter of the length of each pitch. So I'm going to show you a video of what this game actually looks like. Hopefully it'll work all right over the presentation. Okay, so hopefully that video worked all right. If it didn't, I think Peter is going to put up the notes later anyway, so you should be able to see that when you download it. You can see after the game, the players are quite tired. This is the last 30 seconds of a 4-minute game, and this is on the 60 by 20 meter pitch. So I suppose the game gave the coaches an opportunity to work on specific things, such as like the near hand tackle, working hard back and forward, going man to man, stuff like this. So you can alter these small-sided games to suit whatever your gameplay is. So I suppose looking at the results, the pitch that we found that was most effective for preparing players for demands of a match was a 60 by 20 meter pitch. So on that pitch you just saw. When we moved to the 80 by 20 meter pitch, it's a larger pitch. You would think that players would run more on that pitch, but it actually had a negative effect, okay? And the reason we think that is because psychologically, the players, they felt that if they took on a man and bet him, maybe they'd have another 50 meters to run before they get to the goal post, okay? Whereas in the 60 meter pitch, if you bet a man, the goals are much closer. So there's actually no benefit at all to going up to 80 meters. When we're looking at the 40 meter pitch, what we saw that was good for was the number of tackles. So you can imagine it's more condensed. There was more scores, and there was short, sharp bursts as well, and more so than the other pitches. But in terms of the high-speed running, it was a bit lower than the 60 meter pitch. So when we talk about high-speed running in Gaelic football, it's distance ran at a speed greater than 17 kilometers per hour. So if we're looking at the result of the 60 by 20 meter pitch, the players averaged 34 meters per minute at this pace, which is 117% of demands of elite and 131% the demands of sub-elite. Okay, so that would be training above the demands of both elite and sub-elite. In terms of the technical performance, players had twice as many possessions per minute versus match play, and the frequency of passes and tackles were also much higher. For physiological performance, there was no difference actually across all three pitch sizes for physiological performance, but they were all similar to what you would expect in a match. So I suppose in summary, small-sided games can be effective at preparing players for demands of match play, but you need to be cognizant of the pitch size and the number of players that you're going to include in that. So that would be worked into the sub-principles of play. You could work on a lot of sub-principles of play with your small-sided games. You could work on some of the behaviours that you want with the small-sided games. Day after that then would be a midweek day off. Okay, so we need to give players a physical and mental rest. It's positioned at least 2 days from both matches, so from the previous match and the next match. Now you might have noted that in the soccer model that they give players a day off after the game, and we consider this, and we've gone for midweek instead of the day after the game, because the day after the game, what we want players to focus on is their recovery. We want them still to maintain that strength of the build-up, but also we want them to be thinking about the previous match and what they can learn from that. So then when it comes to their day off later on during the week, then they can switch off completely before they get reset for the next match. So after our day off is the principles of play. So working at match tempo, and then having longer duration of games. So an important aspect of this day is the speed of movement and speed of thought. So we want players to be thinking quicker because it's coming up to a match. The other thing is the movement. Okay, so a limitation with a lot of training that we'd see in Gaelic sports is that you can't get up to your max speed in a lot of training games. Okay, so for example, our small-sided games, okay, we just can't get up to our top speed in that. Even a lot of open match play, we won't. So players are going to need about 40 meters of a sprint to hit their top speed. So this is a chance to work in some specific speed work, either doing a couple of races, maybe at the start of training after the warm-up, or some sort of games where it involves speed and sprints. On the sub-principles of play, we're working in smaller groups, okay, so maybe from 1v1 all the way up to 8v8. Now on our principles of play, we want to work on larger groups, so we want to work on the principles all together, so from 8v8 up to 15v15. These would be longer games, so it could be up to 10 minutes long, whereas when we're working on our sub-principles of play, we want them to be short and snappy, so maybe 4 or 5 minutes long. But you don't want to overdo it, okay? So you could be about three days before a match, so you don't want to overdo it here. So you probably only have about 2 10-minute games in this session. And again, it'll have a lower volume than the sub-principles of play, so we're trying to taper down before the match comes. In terms of the gym session then, the day after that, okay, it has to be short and sharp. We don't want to be players hanging around all evening. It's going to be a focus on explosive movements, okay, so it might be a 30-minute session, and you'd work on maybe 3 sets of 3 reps at 40 to 60% of one rep max. So you'd have long rest periods then in between the sets. So we want to recover. If we're training for speed and power, we need that long recovery time. This session is also good in terms of giving the coach a chance to get in and chat to some of the players. So maybe the technical coaches or the manager to chat to some of the players before the match about their role. So it's a good chance to do that. Day following this and before a match, again, it's a day off, non-contact. Players might want to do some activation work. They might want to do a bit of stretching. Some players will want to get focused for the game. Other players will just want to switch off, and maybe they want to get focused on the game day itself. So I suppose just summarising up, if you want to implement tactical periodisation with a team, what are the steps you need to take? So the first step is considering what your coaching philosophy is and how you want the game to be played. Okay, so I suppose now is a good chance. We've a lot of off time, so now is a good chance to really think about what your coaching philosophy is. Start watching teams you want to play, like Dublin, Corofin, whatever team it is, and elements of their play that you think you can bring into your own team. You need to decide whether these principles of play are suited to your players and how can you adapt them to. The next step then is deciding on which training days you will use and stick to that where possible for the season. So we don't want to be chopping and changing each week. If we're training, one night we're training strength on a Monday, and then we're doing speed on a Tuesday, and then Wednesday we're doing principles of play. We want to keep that rigid schedule like we saw in the morpho cycle. So we want to give the players time to recover on each of the physical components. Next thing is breaking the principles of play into sub-principles, practicing these in smaller groups and small-sided games. Next step is working in larger groups then, all up to the full pitch. And then finally, we need to create match scenarios. So once we have our principles of play in order, how are teams going to react to these? What are they going to do? And if they do this, what do we do then? So yeah, just in summary, thanks very much for listening this evening. Look, a lot of stuff is probably familiar to you before. Maybe some things, it might just get you thinking about the likes of the 3-man weave or backs and fours. It might just change your thinking on that. If you have any questions, you can ask there through the chat box or through Peter. My email address is there, and you can find me on Twitter as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Shane. I'll
stop this.
Yeah, if you stop that, we can just change to the video. Perfect. Thanks, Shane. As you're going through there's a load of questions coming in, so okay. We might we have about 15-20 minutes or so. We might talk about a few of them, if that's okay.
Yeah.
A couple of questions that they're quite similar, so I'll try and combine them into one, if that's okay. It seems that the tactical periodization concept is only suitable for intercounty teams where managers have exclusive access to players. Is that your own experience?
No, not essentially. No, like basically at club level, like you're still going to have your players at least 2 days a week. So you're probably going to have them maybe 2 days on the pitch. So you're going to be able to work on your sub-principles of play and your principles of play in those days. The thing where club players are going to lose out compared to county players is that more often than not, they're not going to have that strength and conditioning expertise to back up in terms of the gym sessions. So maybe you might be lucky enough to get someone in maybe once a month or whatever, and they might do up programs for the players. But I suppose like these sessions are gonna, more often than not, they're going to have to be done individually by the player. So They can work on their strength on their own. They can work on their power session later on in the week. But the key thing, I suppose, for coaches in this case is making sure that the club players are accountable for it. Like in the inter-county setting, they're going to have accountability because the S&C coach is going to be at the session with them. So no, I think it could be applied to club level as well.
And what about the situation then where club level games are more chaotic than the structure of, for example, the National League or the Christy Ring Nicky Rackard Championships and so on that Meath have been playing over the last number of years?
Yeah. So I suppose it's up to the team to sort of control that chaos. If you work on your own game, your principles of play, you can sort of try and predict what the opposition are going to do. So I suppose if you can control your own chaos and then have different situations set up for what are they going to do if this happens, what are they going to do if they change in a certain way. So I suppose, yeah, trying to control the chaos would be the key thing there.
And would you suggest, for example, that clubs try and ensure that they have games in the sort of structure that you're talking about here? It seems to me that for this to be working best, you need to have the game structure for the training elements to be incorporated within. So I'm thinking of county league games, which at club level, for example, which might be a little bit more chaotic rather than guaranteed every week, every 6-7 days.
Oh, do you mean in terms of the structure of the week, is it?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, you could have maybe like club games. I know here in Dublin would be on a Wednesday night, and I suppose you'd work your week around that rather than going from Sunday to Sunday. So you'd always be working apart from that. But once you hit the key principles, it doesn't matter what day the game is going to be on. You can focus on those key principles throughout the week. So I suppose it's trying to maintain that alteration throughout the season. But of course, you could have cup games going on. You might have refix games, and you could have 2 games a week. So you're just going to have to adjust for those settings. So this is, in an ideal world, this is what you do. But of course, you have to adjust there as well.
How do you, or what would you advise coaches then around, we'd say, either dual players or maybe younger players who are playing on multiple teams?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I suppose if you take a club approach, like you need to have that discussion in your club. Okay, so if it's a dual club, players are playing both sports. I know, taking the example of Dublin here, is probably one of the best counties for running it, compared to other counties, and the fact that they'll do a game every second week for each sport. So I suppose if you have that organisation in the club and that conversation between the hurling setup and the football setup, that this is the way we're going to do it. On a Monday, we're always going to do our strength training on a Tuesday. Now, I suppose you're going to have to get the buy-in for coaches there. It's going to be learning for different sports, but in terms of the physical components, that's going to be the important thing. So you are going to be able to control that. If you can say that, all right, for both football and hurling, the strength stuff is always on a Monday, power stuff is always on a Friday. I suppose the coaches are going to have their own freedom in between that, but it depends who's controlling this. It depends who's rolling out the model. And then for younger kids playing on multiple teams, like I suppose again, in that scenario, you can probably only control your own team. So it depends if the inter-county team is pushing out this and they want to roll with it. Then when the player goes back to the club, they're not really going to have much control over them. They can advise them that if they're doing a gym session, okay, this is what you should be doing on a specific night, but you're not going to be able to control what they actually do on the pitch, because they're going to be going through a different game plan, different coaching philosophy. So it's going to be hard to control that.
And what about then, you're obviously bringing quite a scientific approach to the game then, and your own experience of working with coaches maybe who don't know about this or less experienced about this, or might be slightly tentative about incorporating something like this. How did you experience bringing that into a club or into a county squad? Yeah,
so I suppose like it is a learning thing. I would have brought in terms of the periodisation part in parts to teams that I've worked with. So I suppose giving them some key figures, not overloading them with data. So say for example, in the lead up to matches. Okay, so we want the team to taper down in terms of the training load. So 2 or 3 days out from a match, we don't want that training to be really high because the players will be fatigued going into the match. So if I can go to the coach and show them figures and say, look, last Thursday we did 10 kilometers before a match and we got beaten by 20 points, and this week we did only 5 kilometers and we won by a point or something like that. Or you could even break it down in terms of, like, there is actual correlations there between the training load in the week before a match and how far players can run and the high speed running in a match as well. So that's one way you could get the buy-in. I suppose that in terms of the coaching philosophy, like, it's not that different to what a lot of players, what a lot of coaches will want to do. So a lot of coaches will want to play games. Players always want to play different sort of games. So it's just about adding a little bit of structure to that, making sure that they're working on a small part of the game and getting that right before they move on to the next part.
How do players and coaches then react when this type of model is introduced? Some people might say we're going too scientific, but what is the player experience, or what's the player feedback that you get? I
suppose the honest thing is I haven't rolled out the coaching element to it. I've just finished up the PhD there, so this is probably the first time that it's been made public, the model. So I suppose you never, as well, like, I'm not going to say like this is the best way to train football because it hasn't been tested out. So until teams in a couple of years' time, maybe someone will say, oh look, I started training that way, and how did you find it? But you can't. It might work for one team, it might not work for another team. So yeah, at the minute it's a concept for training. I suppose it's been applied in soccer. It's been associated with sort of successful coaches, but then there's a lot of other coaches that won't have used it that's also successful.
Yeah, but you're right. It's quite a topical thing in sort of broad coaching circles. I know our speaker on Tuesday, next day, Ryan, presented some material on this at the Games Development Conference earlier in this year as well. So we'll see how that works out. A couple of specific questions, and there's obviously a lot of guys on the call tonight that are quite engaged with this, and they're looking for maybe some detail on some stuff. Yeah. Can you talk maybe about the sub principles of play and what those activities look like?
Yeah, so that is going to vary, I suppose, depending on what the coach wants. Okay, so we'd have to break it down into the 5 game moments. Okay, so first of all, you start off, which of the moments are you going to coach tonight? Okay, is it defensive organization or attacking organization? I suppose you'd work back from the match. So you want to, or maybe from an idea that the coach has in their head, a scenario that they see in a match. So then you'd work it back. How many players do you need to have involved in this? So, like the example I gave was going down wide. Like another one could be giving in a diagonal ball or something like that. So working the ball up one wing and then cutting across, giving a diagonal ball. So you need to break down the elements of it. How many players are going to be involved? So either you can do this through, if you're working on the sub principles of play, you'd want to do it in smaller groups to make sure the players are all getting a go of it, and then working it into a larger scenario. But like, it's just the way you'd coach like a kick out. So if you're coaching different, like a kick out is basically a sub principle of play. So you're working with your groups, and whatever your tactic is, you show the players beforehand. Maybe you walk through it, get them all to walk through it first of all. Maybe get them to do it then with the ball with no opposition. Then you bring in the opposition to give that element of pressure. Let them go at it for a while. Then maybe you have a word with the opposition players that are defending this and tell them to do some specific thing, and then see how does your players react to that, to have the ball. So I suppose that's just the way you sort of deconstruct it.
And it's not a case that you might have, one small group of players working and everyone else sort of sitting around waiting for their turn. You're talking about multiple pitches on a main GAA field, aren't you?
Yeah, and it depends on the numbers that you have. Like if you're working with an inter-county team, like you're going to have 30 players there, probably to go to 30, 35, and you're going to have a few coaches and selectors. So you're able to do that with multiple groups. If you're working with a club team, like typically you might see during the summer anyway, maybe 15 players at training, maybe 18, depending on what way you structure your training with your different squads. So if you're doing like the backs and forwards example, like I said, you can play that with 15 players. They're just everyone's going to be playing at the same time, or else you can just cycle in players. Say if you've 2 or 3 too many, whatever, you can cycle them in and give rest to the players that are doing the most running.
And then can you talk about maybe the pitch sizes that you're working off and the timing of games, time on, time off, and so on?
Yeah. So again, that's going to depend on what the actual objective is. Like the games that we were looking at, the 60 by 20 meter games, they're looking at specifically on tackling on the hard work rate. If it's something that you want to create width and you want to work on creating width, like you don't want to use a 60 by 20 meter pitch to do that because it doesn't allow you to create width. Maybe you can have one on one side of the pitch and then the ball has to be switched to the other side of the pitch. But again, like you want to try and make it as relatable to match play as possible. So I suppose the larger the pitch, the better for the tactical elements that you're going to be working on. But you have to consider how many players are you going to be having in that end of the pitch. So if it's purely tactical that you're going to be working on, and you're not worried about the running performance, then you can afford to have more players, more like a match scenario. But if you're trying to really test the players physiologically, then you're going to need to have fewer players in the same sort of pitch size. And
then again, on your set of days and training days and models for each day for your between games and so on, can you talk about the timing of the speed sessions? A couple of people are after coming in saying that they would do their speed sessions earlier in the week when you were suggesting later.
Yeah. So you could do them earlier in the week if you wanted to, but in terms of our strength, so we want to be working on strength maintenance. So if you do that on a Monday and then say you're training on a Tuesday, you don't want to be doing your speed stuff before that session because the players still aren't recovered from the game at the weekend and then from your strength session. So I suppose after having the day off, it's almost like the start of a new week anyway. So it's like a fresh start to that sub part of the week. So that's the day that we're going to be the freshest in the week is the Thursday or whatever. So that's why it's placed then.
And yeah, go on, sorry.
No, that's it.
Okay, sorry. Then you mentioned about the RP scale as a good way for clubs, an inexpensive way of clubs being able to do a lot of this work. And you mentioned multiplying the RP scale number by the number of minutes for the session and so on.
Yeah.
And I remember Cathal Craig presented something at our Games Development Conference a few years ago about the number of minutes and the RP scale across various different teams and so on. Have you used that across multiple teams, especially at club level? And how many units would you recommend, or what's a maximum number of units that players should use in a given week?
I wouldn't have the figure just off the top of my head. I'd have to go searching for it now, to be honest. But is there something that I've used at club level? I tried it out with a club a few years ago, and it was great at the start, but take-up wasn't there after a while. You're asking a lot of players that maybe they don't have. Some of them will have the same interest as inter-county players, and some of them won't be bothered with it. And if you're missing out on data and they're not reporting it, and then you're trying to make decisions on the training session based off lads missing out, it's not great. So a key thing there is getting people to actually fill it out. But it's still something that we look at in an inter-county level. So we still take RPE and we still take the session duration, because you see, we can't. Of course, you can get these sensors to measure what the players are lifting in the gym and all this, but it gives us an example of what they're doing in their own individual gym work. So I can have the internal training load for the week and see how hard are lads working in the gym, and maybe, okay, this lad was doing a bit too much in the gym and that's why his field session is impacted today. So it is useful, but the key thing is to buy in really and trying to get players to continue to do that.
Absolutely. And then again, a couple more questions on some specifics of your week sessions. Your time on, time off, rest ratios for your speed sessions. What do they look like?
So you're going to have like long rest periods between the speed. So if you're looking at, it depends on the sport that you're doing as well. Like if you're just focusing on speed, like maybe you might do one 45-meter sprint and then you have a minute off. If you're trying to work on like the work-rest ratios that you're going to have in a match, and trying to build up that capacity, maybe not just from a speed element, from an anaerobic performance, you'll be looking at bouts of activity for about 8 to 10 seconds. So in Gaelic football anyway, the average high intensity bout is going to be about 8 to 10 seconds, and then you'll have a 30-second recovery in between that. So you'll be trying to sort of replicate that as much as possible. But the key thing there then is to to train above that, so that if that's the average in the match, then we know that for some periods in the match, maybe a player's going to work for 20 seconds and only get a 10-second recovery. So you're not always going to use the same work to rest ratios for anaerobic performance. For speed, then you always want to have a long gap in between each of the sprints to give the players the time to recover.
And then on your power session, 2 days out from your next game, can you tell us about what that might look like?
Yeah, it'd be a short session. You'd probably do about probably just three exercises. So maybe 2 lower body, 1 upper body. It'd be about 30 minutes long. You'd have do 3 sets of 3 reps of the exercises. So you're doing a low amount of lifts, and you'd be lifting between 40 and 60% of your 1 rep max. So not a massive weight, because what you're focusing on is the speed of the movement rather than the weight there. And then again, it's like the sprints that you're going to have long rest periods in between this. So we don't want to fatigue the players. So you probably have about 4 minutes rest in between each set.
Thanks, Shane. The questions are flying in still. So I know we're giving you a bit of a workout now at this stage. Talk maybe about, again, the club coach experience of like not having numbers for 15 versus 15, and how they might best try and implement this. Yeah,
so I suppose that is a good way of working in the small set of games. Like, you're working on the sub principles is going to be fine. The issue is where you want to work on the principle of an entire match. I suppose one way around it is doing walkthroughs on unopposed games. So how you actually want the players to move, but then you're missing out on that defensive element. So you'd probably have to work on your sub principles separately. So do one sub principle and then do the other sub principle, and then maybe do a walkthrough of how it would go through if you only have 15 players. Or the other thing is, try and match up with another club in the area, maybe someone that's not in the same grade as you, and get them to do a session with you. And if they want to work on some specific things, then you can do that as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is trying to be resourceful as a coach and make sure that you're looked after as best you can. A couple of people asking about your own papers, and I know a number have been published already. But the link, there was a link on the GAA Learning page for this session that included your the link through to your ResearchGate page, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So a lot of Shane's publications are up there as well if you want to go and try and get them. Just seeing a few more questions. Again, RP scale question. Would it be feasible to have a general RP score across the group rather than individuals?
Yeah, I suppose you can get a gauge of where the session is at. Like, it depends how you're collecting it, because sometimes if you, like, say for example, different ways that we'd report it. Okay, so one of them is through an app. Okay, so players will put it into the app after the training session. You can set up free ones on Google Forms. Another way is that you could have a sheet of paper down on the desk after the training session, and players will come over and write their score. Now, the issue with this is certain players will look at the sheet and say, oh, okay, what did Johnny put down? What did Finton put down? And then he puts down the same score anyway. So you get a rough gauge of it. Like, obviously players that have less of a physical capacity are going to find the training session harder. So I suppose if you ask around 10 lads, you can just ask them individually, just when they're walking off the pitch or something like that, then you can get a gauge of your training session. Then yeah, that's fine.
And then I suppose a lot of people asking questions as well about juvenile players and players maybe who don't meet as often, and when you would try and introduce this type of an approach.
Yeah, so I suppose if you're not going to be meeting often, but if they're the same team, like the key things I'd be focusing on there, like they're probably, it depends what they're going to be involved in. If they're on like a juvenile inter-county panel, they're probably doing some sort of physical development, or I suppose nowadays with a lot of development officers around clubs, a lot of clubs will have these sort of development pathways. So if you're getting that time, I suppose the key things you'd be focusing on is the actual game plan of what you want to do. What age would you start bringing that into it? Probably, like, some principles you'd want to be bringing in like around under 12 level, in terms of, tactical, getting them thinking about the space, getting them thinking about going wide, using the depth of the pitch. So yeah, from around that level, I'd start working on it. If you don't have access to them the whole time, you've only access to them once a week, what could you do? Maybe send them on, I suppose, depending on the forum that you have, or send it on to the parents, what the session plan is going to be focused on, and maybe get them to have a look at that. If there was a video maybe that you could get to show them of Dean Rock doing some sort of movement or something like that, and send it on to them or to the parent, whatever way that's working, so they can get a look at that through the training session. So then when you get to the training session, then you can just focus solely on that.
Shane, it's been a fantastically interesting session. Just a last question, if I can. You mentioned that you haven't given this a rollout yet, and there's an awful lot of work that you are doing currently. Are there any suggestions or examples from other teams that you're aware of, or models that you've seen clubs or counties use?
No particular one. I know. Some counties are using elements of this, so I know that the Kerry football team were using elements of the periodisation part of the weekly training model for it, and I know, having worked with Kieran Deely in London for a couple of years, that Kieran was also a proponent of using that, because he would come from the soccer background, working in QPR. But in terms of other sort of models, like there's no training model for Gaelic football at all. Like if you look for it on the internet, there's no sort of guidelines for how teams should train. So I suppose this is why we started to have a look at this, and hopefully it'll encourage more people to sort of come out with their thoughts about how approaches will come, because I suppose that's how we can all learn from it.
Absolutely, and that's why you're going to get a PhD for doing it. Shane, thanks very much for everything this evening. It's been like I said, been a fantastically interesting, informative presentation. Really cutting edge stuff, and we really appreciate the time you've taken. Especially, we know it's so busy for you at the moment. For next week's sessions, just to give people a heads up, you can see there on screen, next Tuesday we have Des Ryan, who's head of Academy Sports Medicine and Sports Science at Arsenal. Des is a Galway man, and he's been very helpful for us over the last number of years with his time and advice on various coaching and coach education matters. And we're really glad that Des is able to join us. We tried to set this up a couple of weeks ago, and things just didn't work out. So he came back to me earlier this week that things would work out now. So it's great to have Des here. Registration for Des' session is available now on the GAA Learning webpage, the same page that you registered for this session with Shane. And next Thursday, Shane just mentioned him. Next Thursday we have Kieran Deely, originally from Wexford, former manager of the London senior football team, and he will do the session next Thursday. But next Tuesday's registration is open now for Des Ryan. So all it leaves is me say thanks again to Shane for a great session. Thanks to you all for coming on the call. One piece of good news for everybody: we had exactly 800 people this evening, which means that for the year so far, we've had 10,069 people viewing these sessions. 10,069 people. We also have over 6,000 people viewed our sessions retrospectively on the GAA Learning YouTube page. So for any of the sessions that you might have missed, or any of the sessions you might want to look at again, if you just go to YouTube and type in GAA Learning, it'll bring you to our YouTube channel, and you can see all the various sessions as well as a range of other videos that are available for you. So Shane, thanks again for everything, and for all of our people on the call tonight, have a safe weekend, and we'll see you all again maybe next Tuesday evening.